Let's start talking about the Dark Fantasy X setting. And I don't want to talk too much about the mechanics. I did that a little bit in my last set of videos. So let's talk a little bit more about the setting. Let me go back to some stuff that I posted a while ago on a different channel. So let me just review them. Chances are nobody remembers them. Here's a few line items about what Dark Fantasy X is like. First off, it is fantasy, but it is also horror in about equal parts, and that should kind of be the feel and the vibe of the game. So if you're expecting D&D, especially because the mechanics are similar to D&D, you shouldn't, because it is equal parts a totally different genre. I am old-fashioned, but I am not old school. In that sense, I mean that although many of my mechanics will be familiar and they harken back to the way D&D was played way back in the day, there's a lot of innovations that are added mechanically, and in particular I kind of reject the whole paradigm of what the game is like, what you play, how you play it, what your characters do, and I do something else. So in that sense, I feel like I'm very old-fashioned, and my tastes were kind of established way back in probably the early 80s. But I'm not old school, and I do reject some of the very specifically old school paradigm. I feel like D&D is a game that's very broad. I don't want to say it's generic, but it is broad, and you can do lots of different things with it. Mine is much more specific on purpose. I have a lot of things, that are very different and are very specific. And it shouldn't feel very much like D&D, even though, again, the mechanics are very similar to D&D. When you're playing it, it should feel like it's a very specific game in a very specific setting with a very specific tone that differs from D&D. I mentioned this several times. The last stop point here on this list is that mechanics superficially resemble D&D somewhat, but the setting does not. And in many cases, that superficial resemblance mechanically doesn't mean all that much, because it's a very rules-light game, which depends very much on rulings. You can have a game that looks very much like D&D, change only a few minor things, and get a pretty different result, which is what I've done, I believe. Let's talk a little bit more about the setting. It's a big setting, but I deliberately have not detailed all of it. I have detailed what I call the three realms. The first is the hill country, which is interesting. It's a little hard to describe. Imagine the American frontier, but instead of 19th century Americans, put Robin Hood or Ivanhoe era medieval Britons in it. Anglo-Saxons, Normans, and Scottish, a handful of Vikings. Kind of put them in what is essentially the American frontier of the middle 1800s, and then make it, of course, more exotic, and have monsters and saber-tooths and woolly mammoths and who knows what else crawling around out there on the frontier too. That is the hill country, and it's got a few. It's not all the frontier. There are some settlements of reasonable size, including at least two really big cities, and then another couple moderately sized cities, as well as tons and tons of smaller towns, and hamlets and villages and settlements and homesteads and who knows what else. Timishburg is the second of the three realms. Imagine Bram Stoker's Transylvania, but again in the Middle Ages. So you don't have any Anglo-Saxons here, but you do have kind of like a German or Austrian upper class, and you do have kind of a Balkan, Romanian or Serbian or Hungarian lower class, although there are also some lingering nobles from that race as well too. So it's not one race is completely over another race, but the Austrian, German, etc. people are kind of, it's their country. The other guys are just kind of the lingering ones who are still there. The third one is Baal Hamazi. This is very much this is kind of a unique thing. It's a desert country. It's one of the demi-human races is from there, and it's very tribal. It's all broken up. There used to be an empire there. It completely fell apart, and now it's kind of fantasy post-apocalyptic. Maybe in some ways is a good way to describe it. My setting is very humanocentric. In fact, I deliberately, if I'm running this game, I deliberately will say that you can only pick humans
to start with, although as you eventually meet other races and come to understand them, they become quote-unquote unlocked and you can use them. Let me just very briefly mention those specific demi-human races that I have. These are not at all familiar from D&D. There's no elves, dwarves, halflings, gnomes, half-orcs, whatever. There's first the gray men, also called the Hyperboreans. They're like people, but they are completely gray in color. Their skin is kind of a chalky gray or granite colored. Their hair is white. Their eyes are silver chrome. Their voice is kind of a raspy whisper. They can't talk as loud or as clearly as humans. And they're from Hyperborea. They have been cursed by what kicked them out of Hyperborea. They now live mostly in the city of Lomar, which is in the north of kind of near, they border with the hill country, and they're generally friendly with the hillmen of the hill country. But they're a very different kind of person. They have their own kind of culture and vibe, and as some of the campaigns progress, you'll get to explore some of them. And then I have Orclings. It's actually two races, orcs and goblins. They are the only specifically non-human race. All the others were humans who have either been cursed or have had some kind of admixture with some kind of supernatural monster or being or whatever. The Orclings are the only ones that are completely non-human. They come from the south and the tropics, and many of them have been wandering north lately because of problems in their home country of Gunacht, but they are not particularly welcome visitors. Some people try to, be thoughtful and kind to them, but the reality is they're not very good neighbors. And if you get too many of them in a place, they are violent, they're impulsive, they're dirty, they can't maintain a high standard of civilization, and they bring down any neighborhood that they live in. So they are mostly passing through the hill country on their way to a refuge. Again, you'll get to talk more about them. You'll get to meet some exemplary members of their race, as well as some that are they match the bad stereotypes 100%. Searchers are the next race. They actually come again from off the map, but they have some beachheads, I guess, in the north. They are a race of humans who have been touched by some kind of elemental fiery spirit. They usually have brick red skin, flaming red, orange, or blonde hair, bright yellow eyes, and that's a few supernatural fiery abilities. Wendaks, also called Atlanteans, are much like Neanderthals, but they have been cursed by the fall of Atlantis, and they are literally devolving into apes. They're not there yet. They're still more man than ape, but they literally will sicken and die if they have metal on their person or in their general vicinity. So they are stuck in the Stone Age, and some of them are devolving more into extremely primitive man-ape-like conditions. Although some of them manage to hang on to kind of more of a Neolithic advanced Stone Age position, but they are also kind of savage. They're also kind of bitter and resentful. They again are leftovers from Atlantis that were not on the island when it sank under the sea, and they became
kind of this savage indigenous race, I guess, over much of the territory, but there were never very many of them, and so they kind of hide out in the woods and stuff. Wood roses are next. These are a race of people who have been corrupted or tainted or admixed, if you want to call it, with the blood of werewolves. They are also kind of animalistic, but they're not primitive in the sense that the Wendaks are. They're more like your stereotypical ranger on steroids, and they do have some savage features. They're kind of hairy, almost furry even, and they're quite strong. They're very attuned to the wilderness and prefer the wilderness, but they're not primitive per se, other than that they don't really prefer to build cities and have nations. They're kind of more at a tribal level. Seraphs are next. These are people who have the admixture of fallen angels as they're somewhere in their ancestry. They tend to be quite beautiful. They have silver hair, silver chrome eyes, but unlike the gray men, they look like people. They're just extremely beautiful people. But because their ancestry is a fallen angel, they do have a tendency to fall themselves, and many of them, of course, fight that tendency, but many of them are happy to kind of take advantage of their natural charisma and beauty and become kind of sociopathic narcissists. They don't have any unique
civilization, culture, there's not enough of them, so they're just kind of a handful of them scattered here and there throughout the city. The last demi-human race is the Kemlings. Their ancestry is demonic. If you want to imagine what they look like, think Nightcrawler from the X-Men, except without a tail, and then put like Darth Maul horns on them. Or if you want, you can imagine Grazit, the demon lord, and shrink them down to regular human size. It would kind of be the same either way. So they've got like sooty black or dark gray skin. They've also got, burning yellow eyes, and they've got kind of a ring of small horns around their head. For most of them, it's a ring around their head like a crown, but they can also come in other patterns. Most of them, it's kind of hidden in their hair, but some of them, they deliberately shave their heads so they can show off their horns. They're the ones that are still kind of very proud of their racial ancestry. But because their empire has fallen apart very specifically because of the chaos that comes with consorting with demons, most of them kind of feel like they have to live down the exploits, if you will, of their ancestors. So there's like a diaspora of a lot of them who've kind of fled the chaos of their homeland and tried to make a life somewhere else. There's also a lot of them up in Baal Hamazi. That's the post-apocalyptic area. That's where they were once the imperial rulers. Now it's at best a land of modest city-states and tribes. And of course, there's tons of humans, lots of humans, and there's a few different ethnicities. I'll talk about that in another video. How else is this different than what you're used to? Magic is going to be Lovecraftian. There is a sanity mechanic. It's a rules light sanity mechanic, but I've woven it into it. There is also magical failure chances. Not only can you have attacks on your sanity if you try to cast a spell and fail, but you can also have mishaps that can be quite catastrophic. So casting a spell is always risky, and chances are you could probably do okay most of the time, but you get that natural one, you're in trouble. So everybody who can cast spells is always a little bit careful about it, and there's no class that casts spells. In fact, there's no classes at all, but anybody, if they find a spell, can learn to cast it if they're willing to pay the cost. So anybody can be a sorcerer, but sorcerers here it's dangerous to be a sorcerer, and not just because of the effect of casting magic, which is itself dangerous, but because magic is seen, rightly so, as witchcraft and a danger to society. It is highly illegal almost everywhere, and if you out yourself in public as a sorcerer, the most likely thing that's going to happen is a mob is going to attempt to lynch you. What else? There's some swashbuckling action. Of course, I couldn't possibly make a game that didn't have that. The focus is more on investigation. Even though the rules are D&D-like, don't imagine the game as being like D&D. Think of it more as Call of Cthulhu or the X-Files in a fantasy setting, and then you'll be kind of more on the right track. So what do your characters actually do if they're not exploring dungeons, trying to find treasure, et cetera, et cetera? Well, they're probably going to do is be essentially freelance supernatural bounty hunters who travel around looking for people who have supernatural problems and solving them for them. I know that's a little bit proscriptive, but I believe in the so-called narrow, wide, narrow approach to running a campaign. I feel like when most people start campaigns, they don't really know exactly how to do it, and they're wandering around looking for the game. So I'm going to give them something this is what you're going to do, or at least what you're going to start out doing. And as more and more hooks come their way, maybe they'll eventually wander off. Maybe they'll fall to the supernatural temptation or something else. Maybe they'll totally do something different as the campaign evolves, but they will start out at least being these kind of supernatural troubleshooters, Mulder and Scully of a fantasy setting, so to speak. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. Again, Call of Cthulhu in a D&D setting. Or if you want, that's also not too dissimilar to the vibe of Warhammer Fantasy Role-Playing, although I don't really have the same kind of setting that they do. It's not like a Renaissance, corrupt, grimdark, Holy Roman Empire. It's a very kind of a different type of setting, but it's got a very similar tone and very similar approach to what the PCs would presumably actually be doing. And so in that sense, I think that's a good comparison and a useful point of reference as to what this kind of game would be like. So anyway, when I come back, let's talk a little bit more about, let's dig into some of the details and deep dive a few of these topics. But that's a good summary and a good place to start, I think.